My name is Anna Hayes. I'm 42 years old, and for 20 years, I was a medic in the United States Air Force. My life was a map of places most people only read about, a collection of moments written in the quiet hum of AC-130 and the hurried breath of a life held in my hands. I've held the hands of the dying under the stark, unforgiving lights of a field hospital and whispered reassurances into the dusty air of deserts half a world away. I've learned that the deepest wounds are not always the ones that bleed. I carry these silent stories with me, not as burdens, but as quiet reminders of the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. But none of that hard-won wisdom, none of that quiet strength, seemed to matter on that cool autumn afternoon in a Portland, Oregon courthouse. I sat on a polished wooden bench and listened as my older brother, Arthur, stood up, his expensive suit a shield of corporate armor. He pointed a finger not at me, but in my general direction, as if acknowledging me directly was too distasteful. His voice, usually so smooth and measured, was sharp with a self-righteous indignation that filled the room. "Your Honor," he declared to the silent courtroom, "she was never truly one of us. She abandoned this family for a life we couldn't understand, and now she returns expecting a reward for it." The words hung in the air, heavier than any physical blow. They were not an accusation of fraud, but something far more personal, far more wounding. They were an erasure of my place in the only family I had ever known. The room fell into a heavy silence, thick with unspoken history. The judge, a woman with kind eyes that now held a flicker of confusion, simply blinked. My mother, Eleanor, seated beside Arthur, smoothed a non-existent crease in her skirt, her gaze fixed on her lap, a portrait of practiced detachment. And Leo, my younger brother, my quiet, artistic Leo, sank just a little lower in his seat, his shoulders hunched as if to ward off the chill of Arthur's words. He said nothing. And me? I felt the sting, a deep, familiar ache that settled in my chest. It was the old, hollow feeling of being on the outside looking in. But I didn't let it show. My years in service had taught me to hold my ground, to anchor myself in the truth when everything else was shifting sand. The pain was real, sharper than any piece of shrapnel, but it was a pain I had learned to navigate. And this time, I had not come to the battle unarmed. Without a word, I reached into the simple leather portfolio at my side. It was old and worn, a gift from my father years ago. The soft scrape of my chair on the floor was the only sound as I stood. My footsteps were quiet but deliberate as I approached the bench. I didn't look at Arthur or my mother. My focus was on the path ahead. With a quiet finality, I placed the portfolio before the judge. She looked at me, a question in her eyes, before opening it. She read the first page, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to focused attention. She turned to the second, and a subtle line appeared between her brows. With each page she turned, I watched the professional mask slip, replaced by a growing storm of disbelief, and then a cold, hard clarity. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, when they finally lifted from the pages, were no longer kind, they were flint. "This court is taking a recess," she announced, her voice low but carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the silence. "The doors will be secured. No one is to leave this room." A ripple of confusion went through the gallery. Before anyone could fully grasp the change in atmosphere, two stern-faced individuals in dark suits entered from a side door. They weren't police, but they moved with a quiet, federal purpose that was just as intimidating. One stood by the main doors, the other approached the bench. Behind me, I heard Arthur make a choked, protesting sound, the first crack in his confident facade. The world he had so carefully constructed was beginning to fracture. His lawyer, a man who had been the picture of smug assurance moments before, let a pen slip from his fingers, clattering onto the floor. My mother's hands were now gripping her purse, her knuckles white. Leo's eyes, wide and filled with a sorrowful understanding, finally met mine across the room. I stood my ground, my heart beating a steady, measured rhythm. I wasn't there to fight, not anymore. I was there to let the truth speak for itself. If you have ever felt like a stranger in your own home, if you have ever had to build your own definition of family from the ground up, then you will understand the journey that led me to that moment. This isn't a story of revenge, but of reclamation. It's about finding your own true north when the maps you were given lead you astray. So, let me take you back to a place of misty mornings and gnarled apple trees, to a small farmhouse where this story truly began. The place was called Cider Creek Hollow. It was a small, unassuming farmhouse nestled in a gentle fold of the Oregon coastal range, about an hour's drive from Port Blossom. Its white paint was peeling, and the green shutters had faded to the color of sea glass, but it stood sturdy and resolute against the passage of time. It wasn't a grand estate, it was something far better. It was a place with soul. An ancient apple orchard, with trees like gnarled old men, stood sentinel behind the house, their branches reaching for the sky. The air smelled of damp earth, salt from the distant ocean, and the faint, sweet promise of apples. My father had left it to me, and only me, in his will. For the first time since I'd left home at 18, I had a place to anchor myself, a piece of ground that felt like it was mine, even if the rest of my family believed I had no right to it. The day the will was read in the sterile, mahogany-paneled office of our family lawyer, the battle lines were drawn in silence. I saw it in the subtle clench of Arthur's jaw, the telltale sign that he was mentally filing this away under grievances. He, who had been groomed since birth to take over Sterling Coast Developments, our father's successful property firm, could not comprehend this deviation from the expected script. My mother, Eleanor, whose life was a carefully curated performance of social grace and family loyalty, refused to meet my eyes. Her disappointment was a palpable force in the room, a silent judgment on my life choices. And Leo, my sweet, gentle Leo, just stared at his own hands, a silent navigator of the family's turbulent emotional currents. The will itself was straightforward. My father, in his quiet way, had tried to be fair. Arthur was given my father's majority shares in Sterling Coast, the empire he already effectively ran. Leo, who had no interest in the corporate world and made his living as a talented, if not widely known, landscape painter, was given a substantial trust, enough to ensure he could follow his passion without financial worry. And I, the prodigal daughter, the one who had chosen service over shares, was given the farmhouse. That was it. No complicated clauses, no hidden meanings. Just a piece of land and a quiet old house. For a few weeks, a fragile peace settled over us. I moved into the hollow and felt a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I'd been missing for 2 decades. The rhythm of the place began to heal something deep inside me. I spent my days in old jeans and work boots, my hands covered in dirt and paint. I repaired the creaking porch swing where my father used to sit and watch the sunset. I cleared away the thorny blackberry vines that had tried to reclaim the garden, discovering the hardy skeletons of old rose bushes beneath. At night, I would wrap myself in a patchwork quilt my grandmother had made, a fire crackling in the hearth, and listen to the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. It was the sound of my childhood, a lullaby I had long forgotten. I allowed myself a sliver of hope that maybe, this time, they would just let me be. But in a family built on control and unspoken expectations, peace is a temporary ceasefire, not a lasting treaty. The official-looking envelope arrived on a Tuesday in early spring. It felt heavy in my hand, thick with the cold weight of legal paper and a bitterness that seemed to seep through the expensive stationery. Arthur and my mother were formally contesting the will. The document, drafted by their high-powered legal team, was a masterpiece of cold, clinical character assassination. It claimed I had taken advantage of our father's declining health, that I had unduly influenced him with embellished stories of my military career, and that my long absence from the family was proof of my manipulative and opportunistic nature. Each sentence was a carefully crafted stone, designed to build a wall between me and my father's memory, to portray me as a fraud. My name, Anna Hayes, was repeated over and over, not as a daughter, not as a veteran, but as a usurper. They weren't just trying to take the house. They were trying to take my story, to rewrite 20 years of my life into a fiction that suited their narrative. There had been no phone call, no attempt at conversation. Just this formal, brutal declaration of war, with a summons and a deadline. I had 30 days to respond. I called Leo that evening. The call went to voicemail. His outgoing message was soft, hesitant, just like him. I didn't leave a message. I knew he was caught in the middle, and I wouldn't force him to choose a side. So, I did what the Air Force had ingrained in me. When the mission changes, when the terrain becomes hostile, you don't panic. You assess, you gather your resources, and you prepare. My resources weren't weapons or armor. They were dusty boxes filled with a life they had refused to see. Service records, deployment orders, performance reviews signed by commanding officers, photographs of me with my unit, faces young and hopeful and tired, all at once. There were letters, thin and worn, sent home from desolate outposts, filled with words I'd written to try and bridge the gap between my world and theirs. I laid it all out on the sturdy oak table in the farmhouse kitchen, proof of a life lived with honor. I was preparing for a new kind of conflict, one fought not against a foreign enemy, but against the people who shared my blood. It was a war I knew I would have to fight alone. Arthur was born into a world that was tailor-made for him. He was the heir apparent, the golden son destined to inherit not just our father's business, but his entire persona. He was handsome, charming, and possessed an innate understanding of power and leverage. People were drawn to him, and my mother viewed him with a reverence that bordered on worship. He was the embodiment of the family legacy. And then there was me. I was the wild card, the question mark. I didn't fit into their neat, 5-year plans. I preferred climbing the ancient oaks in the backyard to sitting in on business meetings. While Arthur was learning to read financial reports at our father's side, I was in the orchard with Leo, a sketchbook in my lap, trying to capture the way the light filtered through the leaves. Leo understood. He saw the world in color and light too. But he learned early to make himself small, to stay out of the way. I never learned that skill. It wasn't that I resented them. It was a simpler, more painful truth. I just didn't belong. My mother, Eleanor, moved through life with a seamless elegance. Every word was chosen, every gesture calculated to maintain the family's pristine image. To her, loyalty was synonymous with obedience, and my path was a flagrant act of rebellion. I had no interest in the charity galas or the strategic marriages that constituted her world. I wanted a life of purpose, a life that mattered in a way I couldn't yet articulate. The day I announced I was enlisting, I was 18. The ensuing argument was monumental. My mother wept with a dramatic flair that suggested I had announced my own funeral. Arthur, already a junior at an Ivy League business school, simply laughed a short, dismissive laugh. Leo, as always, vanished into the quiet refuge of his room. My father was the only one who didn't shout. He stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable, and watched me. When I walked out the door that evening with a duffel bag slung over my shoulder, he was the only one who followed me onto the porch. He didn't say, "Don't go." He just handed me the worn leather portfolio. "For your papers," he'd said gruffly. "Keep them safe." It was his quiet, complicated way of giving me his blessing. The years that followed carved me into a new person. Service changes you. It strips away the non-essential, hones you down to your core. It teaches you about teamwork, sacrifice, and a kind of love that is forged in shared hardship. I came home with scars, both visible and invisible. I didn't come back looking for a parade or for pity. I came back hoping, foolishly perhaps, to finally connect with my family. I thought that maybe, just maybe, they would see the woman I had become and find some measure of respect for the journey I had taken. The silence at my first family dinner back home told me everything I needed to know. It was a carefully constructed wall of polite conversation that skirted around the last 2 decades of my life. If I mentioned a place, Arthur would deftly change the subject to a new resort Sterling Coast was developing. If a memory threatened to surface, my mother would suddenly become fascinated by the view out the dining room window. Leo just kept his eyes on his plate, a silent, pained witness to my exclusion. They didn't want to know where I'd been or what I'd survived. My life was an inconvenient truth that disturbed the placid surface of their world. I was a ghost at my own homecoming. So, when the lawsuit arrived, it wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation of what I had felt my entire life. They had never misunderstood me. They had simply never accepted me. The cruelty of it was what took my breath away. It wasn't just about the greed for a small piece of property. It was their chilling willingness to dismantle my identity, to negate 20 years of sacrifice, all to maintain their grip on a narrative and a man's memory they had reshaped to fit their own needs. That evening, I sat on the porch swing my father had built, my boots planted firmly on the weathered planks. A cold wind swept in from the coast, carrying the scent of rain. I didn't rage. I didn't weep. I made a quiet, resolute decision. They had started this fight, but I would finish it. On my terms. War teaches you that raw emotion is a liability in a crisis. It clouds your judgment. What keeps you alive is discipline, strategy, and the ability to control your own breathing when the world is exploding around you. So, I pushed aside the hurt and the anger, and I began to work. I methodically compiled my life. I contacted the National Archives to get certified copies of my entire service record. I wrote to old friends, former commanders, men and women I had served with, asking for written testimonies. I spent long, quiet nights at the kitchen table, cross-referencing every detail, every date, every commendation. The old ache in my shoulder, a souvenir from a chaotic evacuation in a war-torn country, was a constant, physical reminder of the reality they were trying to deny. But paper, I knew, would be my most powerful weapon. I wasn't just building a defense. I was building an undeniable truth. In the process, I found something unsettling. In my digital records, there were small, almost imperceptible anomalies. A few misdated entries, a digital signature that looked slightly off, a transfer order that was logged out of sequence. It wasn't enough to prove anything conclusively, but it was enough to make the hair on my arm stand up. The alterations were too clean, too precise. This wasn't a clerical error. It was sabotage, performed by someone with skill and access. The chilling realization dawned on me. This wasn't just Arthur and my mother's idea. They had help. One night, as I was staring at the glow of my laptop screen, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. A simple text message, 5 words long, "Meet me at the Overlook." Alone. There was no name, but I knew. It was Leo. We met the next evening at a place we called Falcon's Perch as kids, a dramatic cliff overlooking the churning Pacific. The mist was so thick you could taste the salt. Leo stood with his hands jammed in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the gray expanse of the ocean. He looked exhausted, as if he were carrying the weight of the entire family on his slender shoulders. "I didn't think they would go this far, Anna," he said, his voice almost lost in the wind. "I thought it was just bluster. Arthur's usual noise." I didn't respond. I just waited, letting the silence stretch between us. He had to be the one to cross it. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored my own. "I watched them do it," he confessed, his voice cracking. "I heard the phone calls. They hired some tech firm to clean up your records, they said. To create doubt." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I was a coward. But I can't let them do this to you. To Dad's memory." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, holding it out to me in his trembling hand. "He would have wanted you to have this." Back in the quiet solitude of the farmhouse, I slid the flash drive into my laptop. My hands were shaking. What I found stole the air from my lungs. It was all there. A folder of emails between Arthur and my mother, callously discussing how to frame the narrative, how to paint me as mentally unstable. There were invoices from a digital security firm in Seattle, detailing data management services related to my military records. There were drafts of the legal challenge, with notes in my mother's elegant handwriting suggesting more inflammatory language. But the worst was a separate folder labeled contingency. Inside were fabricated financial documents, creating a trail of fake donations to obscure charities, all made from an account set up in my name. They had built an entire world of lies, ready to deploy the moment I fought back. They had anticipated my every move, except one. They had never anticipated that Leo, their quiet, compliant Leo, would find his voice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my father's old oak table, the evidence glowing on my screen, and I felt a profound, aching sadness. They didn't know me at all. They saw me as the rebellious girl who ran away, the unpredictable element they couldn't control. They had underestimated the woman I had become. The service had taught me patience, strategy, and the quiet power of undeniable truth. You don't walk into a storm and hope it spares you. You anchor yourself and you wait for it to pass. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse air was sterile and cold. I chose to wear a simple, well-tailored charcoal gray suit. Not my uniform. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of claiming I was hiding behind the cloth of my country. I wore no medals, no ribbons. I was just Anna Hayes, a woman they were trying to erase. The courtroom was fuller than I expected. A few local reporters were in the back, drawn by the scent of a prominent local family tearing itself apart. Arthur sat at the plaintiff's table, looking every inch the powerful CEO, a mask of concerned gravity firmly in place. My mother was beside him, a pillar of Chanel-clad composure, her pearls gleaming softly against her throat. She never once looked my way. Leo sat a few rows behind them, a solitary island in a sea of tension, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The proceedings began. Arthur's lawyer was smooth, weaving a narrative of a concerned family worried about their estranged, and possibly unstable, sister who had mysteriously reappeared to claim a cherished family property. He spoke of my unconventional life and periods of no contact as if they were symptoms of a disease. It was a masterful performance, and I was cast as the villain. Then Arthur took the stand. He spoke of his devotion to our father, his commitment to the family legacy. He painted me as a transient, a person who had severed all family ties and only returned when there was something to gain. And then came the final, carefully rehearsed blow. He looked at the judge, his expression a perfect blend of sorrow and conviction, and said, "She was never truly one of us." The silence in the wake of his words was absolute. It was a public disinheritance, a final, cutting severance. I held the judge's gaze, my own expression calm. I would not let them see my pain. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Davies, rose. She didn't engage in theatrics. She simply and methodically presented my certified service record, the commendations, the letters from my superiors. Her voice was calm and factual, a stark contrast to the emotional drama that had preceded it. Then, the judge looked at me. "Miss Hayes, do you have anything to add?" "I do, Your Honor," I said, my voice quiet but clear. I stood and walked to the bench, the leather portfolio in my hand. I didn't offer a speech. I didn't need to. The truth was in my hands. I placed it gently on the bench. "I believe this will clarify the situation." The judge, intrigued, opened it. I watched her face as she read. I saw the shift from curiosity to shock, then to a cold, simmering anger. The carefully constructed facade of the Vance family was dissolving under her gaze, page by damning page. "This court is taking a recess," she announced, her voice like steel. "The doors will be secured." The two federal agents entered, their presence instantly changing the gravity of the room. Arthur's face went pale. He started to rise, to protest, but his lawyer put a restraining hand on his arm. My mother looked as if she had been turned to stone, her perfect composure finally shattered. And Leo, my dear brother Leo, let out a slow, quiet breath, a sound of release that only I could understand. He had carried his burden, and now it was lifted. The agents approached the bench, and the judge handed them the portfolio. The truth was no longer mine to carry alone. The judge didn't speak to the courtroom at large. She kept her voice low, conferring with the agents and the bailiff. The civil case was over. A federal investigation was just beginning. The first thing she had seen was the evidence of the tampered military records, a federal offense. Then, the fabricated financial trails, constituting wire fraud and identity theft. And finally, the emails, a clear conspiracy to defraud the court and manipulate an estate. Each page was a nail in the coffin of their lies. I didn't look at Arthur. I didn't need to see the panic in his eyes. I felt it. I felt the entire axis of his world tilting. I did, however, look at my mother. Her face was a blank mask of shock, her mouth slightly open, as if a word had died on her lips. She was a director whose actors had suddenly gone off script, and she had no idea how to reclaim the scene. And Leo. He sat in the gallery, his hands still folded, but his shoulders were no longer hunched. They were relaxed. In his quiet, unassuming way, he had done the bravest thing of all. He had chosen truth over loyalty, integrity over family image. As the agents took the portfolio, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted from my soul. It wasn't a feeling of victory or triumph. It was something quieter and far more profound. It was peace. It was the feeling of being seen, truly and completely, for the first time. When the judge finally struck the gavel to formalize the recess, the sound was not of an ending, but of a beginning. The rot had been exposed to the light. I walked out into the hushed hallway, needing air. The sounds of the courthouse, the distant ringing of a phone, the murmur of voices, seemed to come from a great distance. I leaned against the cool marble wall and took my first deep, untroubled breath in months. My body felt light, my hands no longer trembling. Footsteps approached, hesitant at first, then steady. It was Leo. His eyes were red-rimmed, but for the first time in years, he looked me straight in the eye. "Anna," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." I managed a small, genuine smile. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Leo." "I should have stood up to them years ago," he whispered, looking down at the floor. "I just let it happen." "You stood up when it mattered most," I said, reaching out and placing a hand on his arm. "You chose what was right. That takes more courage than anything." He gave a single, sharp nod, a world of unspoken history passing between us in that one small gesture. We stood there in silence for a moment, two siblings finding their way back to each other across a wasteland of family secrets. The fallout was swift and quiet. There were no dramatic headlines, just a series of discreet legal actions. Arthur and my mother's names vanished from the society pages and charity boards. Their world of influence and image crumbled, not with a bang, but with a quiet, inexorable erosion of respect. I returned to Cider Creek Hollow. The legal title to the farmhouse was now unequivocally mine, but that was no longer the point. It had become my sanctuary, my place of healing. That spring, as the legal storm raged in the city, I planted a new garden. I learned the art of pruning the old apple trees, cutting away the dead wood to make way for new growth. It felt symbolic. Leo started visiting on weekends. We didn't talk about Arthur or our mother. We didn't need to. Instead, we worked side by side in the orchard, our comfortable silence punctuated by the snip of shears and the calls of birds. He brought his easel and painted the changing light on the hills, his canvases filling with the peace he found here. One afternoon, he helped me repair the old stone wall at the edge of the property. Our hands, one a painter's, one a medic's, worked together, fitting the stones back into place, building something new and strong from the ruins of the old. I don't know if our family will ever be whole again. Some wounds are too deep to ever fully close. But I have learned that family is not always about the blood you share, but about the truth you are willing to stand for. It's about the people who see you, who honor your journey, and who help you rebuild your walls when they crumble. Some evenings, I sit on the porch swing, a cup of tea warming my hands, and watch the last rays of sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air is cool and clean, and the only sound is the wind in the pines. I am not defined by the battle I fought in that courtroom, nor by the wars I survived overseas. I am defined by this peace, by the quiet strength I found within myself. I am here. I am whole. And in the quiet solitude of this place I have finally, truly, come home.